Hello, this is David Hardman, and this is the final presentation in the series Introduction to Cognitive Psychology, in which I'll be looking at some of the ideas and key figures involved in the cognitive revolution. The development of cognitive ideas started to take off just subsequent to the Second World War, partly influenced by developments in computation that were going on at that time, and then really started to take off in a big way in the late 1950s and in the 1960s. One of the first figures to write in a cognitive vein was Kenneth Craik, a British philosopher and psychologist who wrote a book called The Nature of Explanation, in which he described how people might use internal models of reality in order to make predictions about the everyday world. These called mental models. Alan Turing was famous for his code-breaking work at Bletchley Park in the UK during the Second World War, but he made a notable contribution to cognitive science through his work on Turing machines and the Turing test. Turing machines were a theoretical concept which described how a person might go about doing mathematical operations, and they showed that through symbol processing it was possible to compute any numbers that were computable. And moreover, the Turing machine was able to mimic the activity of any other computational device. The Turing test was a test for machine intelligence. So this was based on an old parlour game, and the idea was, suppose you want to see whether it's possible to distinguish between a human being and a computer. A human interrogator would type questions into a keyboard and would receive responses from an unseen responder, and this unseen responder might be a person, but it might be a computer. And if the interrogator was unable to distinguish the responses of the computer and the person, then you would have to conclude that the computer was intelligent. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon in 1963 produced a program called the General Problem Solver, and this was a computer program which was programmed with only a few rules, but nonetheless was able to solve some quite complex problems. They also talked about the physical symbol system hypothesis, and this is the idea that symbol processing is a necessary and sufficient condition for intelligent behavior. So essentially this was saying that the hardware doesn't really matter terribly much. It doesn't matter whether it's biological hardware or computer hardware. The key thing is that symbol processing is going on. In 1953, Colin Cherry carried out some experiments into human attention. He was interested in the cocktail party problem, which is how is it possible when you're at a party, you're focusing on one conversation, how is it that you manage to screen out the things that other people are saying? And a few years later, Donald Broadbent developed a theory which tried to describe exactly how this was possible, and also some of the limitations on attention. And these ideas showed that human beings are limited capacity processors, rather in the same way that people were talking about computers as limited capacity processors. 1956 was a big year for the cognitive revolution. George Miller published his paper on memory, in which he talked about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, again showing that there were capacity limitations on human cognition. There were also two big conferences in that year in the United States. There was one at MIT, which featured Chomsky, George Miller, and Newell and Simon. And in 1956, there was a conference at Dartmouth University on the topic of artificial intelligence. And then several years later, in 1967, after various theorists and researchers had been developing these ideas, Ulrich Neisser published the textbook Cognitive Psychology. So this was the first book to have cognitive psychology in the title. On the screen here is one of the best known cognitive models. This was Atkinson and Shiffrin's modal model of memory, and it illustrates how cognitive psychologists have developed flow diagrams to describe how certain processes might occur in a series of steps. So here we see some input from the outside world that goes into sensory memory, which is a very fleeting kind of memory, and then some of that information just gets displaced, but some of it gets passed on to short-term memory, which is thought to last for about 20 seconds and has a limited capacity of approximately 7 items. Information can be kept in short-term memory through rehearsal, but then information gets passed on to long-term memory. And of course, information can be retrieved from long-term memory back into short-term memory. But the key thing about this particular model is really its use of a flow diagram like this to show different stages in cognition in which information gets processed and transformed. And finally, here's a very famous experiment from cognitive psychology carried out by Shepard and Metzler in 1971. And in these studies, participants were shown a pair of shapes on a screen, such as the ones in the top row on the left or the bottom row on the left. People have to press a button in order to say whether they think these items are the same shape or whether they're different shapes. But what you find for responses to the correct pairings of identical shapes is that as the angle of rotation increases, so does the response time of the participant, and it's a linear transformation. If it's plotted in this graph in the bottom right here, you can see that there's a straight line. So as the angle increases, so does the response time. So it's as though participants themselves have a representation in their head which they rotate in order to try and answer this question. So that's pretty much it, except to add that cognitive psychology is part of a wider discipline, a kind of umbrella discipline that we call cognitive science. And this includes philosophy, linguistics, computer science, anthropology, and neuroscience. So all of these disciplines have something to say about the nature of the mind. And that's where I'm going to finish for now. Thank you.